Philip stares at the plane in front of him. He'll finally be able to see what's inside of him. He hesitates a bit more, but finally goes inside. His friends follow him. They can't believe what they see. How could something so big go unnoticed for so long? Soon they will find out that people deliberately avoided this place. Before we start, can we get this video to 1,000 likes? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. A few days earlier, Philip had been struggling to decide whether he should go inside alone. He couldn't see a safe way to do it, and if he got hurt, it wouldn't be easy to get help. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Philip could no longer feel his hands from the cold. He had to get help. The matter was too serious for Philip to handle on his own, so he called two of his colleagues, who immediately set off on a trip to Alaska. No one had ever seen anything like it, so they had to get on the plane together. But neither of them was ready for this view. Philip was the first person to board the plane. His mouth immediately dropped open in amazement. How is it possible that no one knew about it? The explorers stared at each other in disbelief. They knew they would soon become famous. But what was on the plane that was so important? Philip is a scientist who moved to a small town in Alaska only because he heard an unbelievable story about it. Someone from the city sent him this letter, though there was no apparent reason for it. He was chosen, as he used to say, and to achieve his goal, he was able to sacrifice everything. Philip arrived in the city a few days after receiving the letter. Philip began his investigation by knocking on the door and asking the locals about the legend. However, they did not welcome him with open arms. Philip had already knocked on almost every door in the area when he saw an old man crossing the road. Philip ran up to him and asked if he could tell him something about an urban legend. The man looked at him for a moment, then said, "Come to Old Horse in an hour." Philip promised to be there, though he had no idea what the Old Horse was. It turned out that Starry Horse is a small cafe in the city center. When Philip went inside, he saw that the older man was already there. Philip sat across from him. There was once a plane number 66 that was going to Japan. No one knew who was on the plane or what it was carrying. However, once it took off, it disappeared from the radar almost immediately. Some say it was caused by a storm, but scientists have disproved this theory. To this day, however, it is not known what happened to this plane. Philip stared at the man in disbelief, but he was completely calm. Philip wanted to ask more questions, but his interlocutor suddenly got up and left the cafe without a word. There was only one thing left to do, and Philip wasn't entirely happy about it. All Philip could do now was start searching. First, he had to find out what route the plane might have taken. But where to get such information? When Philip returned to his quarters, he saw a small note tacked to the door. He read one and only sentence: "Go to the east side of town and follow the mountain path and then find Theo." Philip couldn't stop thinking about who might have left him this message. And who was Theo anyway? Instead of answers, more and more questions appeared in Philip's head. Still, he knew what he should do now. Philip packed his backpack with everything he might need. Then he started his journey through the deserted city. After several hours of walking, Philip finally reached the first point of his journey. He saw a small house in the distance. There was a dark cloud on the horizon, so he reached the cabin just in time. But then something happened that he couldn't have predicted. The door suddenly opened, and Philip saw the silhouette of an elderly man. "Theo?" he asked. The man stepped aside. He didn't say a word to Philip, though he seemed to be waiting for him. Who the hell is he? The man pointed to the bed, and on it lay another note. Because of all these cryptic messages, Philip felt like he was playing a stalking game. If their author knew where the plane was, why didn't he try to find it himself? The note contained geographical coordinates. The next day, he was optimistic and continued his search, but he didn't foresee one. Philip walked so long that he could no longer feel his legs. But there was still no sign of the plane. Has anyone played any games with him? Philip sharpened his eyesight and saw something that was decidedly unlike anything natural. Everything indicated that a wing was sticking out of the snow, walked straight towards the wreck. Meanwhile, it was getting darker every minute. Philip was only halfway there when the sun began to set. He could see a small flat patch of land on which to pitch his tent. At night, the wind started to pick up. Even though Philip lay under a thick sleeping bag in a sealed tent, It was getting colder. Philip woke up in the morning with frozen hands and icicles on his chin. And when it got a little warmer, he broke camp and continued his journey. He was already very close. When Philip finally got to the plane, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was almost completely covered by snow, so he wrote down the exact coordinates of the wreck and returned to Theo's cabin. Philip called two of his best friends, Lincoln and Greg, who were also scientists. They had no idea Philip had been to Alaska, but they were sure he found something important since he was telling them. They immediately decided to join him and were not disappointed in the slightest. Lincoln and Greg arrived 3 days later. Philip led them to the crash site, and they followed in his footsteps without hesitation. But they didn't expect something like this. Lincoln suggested they could drill through one of the plane's doors. Maybe this will help them get in. Philip, however, was now focused on something else entirely. It seemed to him that something was sticking out of the tail of the plane. It was a small orange device, and he was pretty sure what it was. He found the plane's black box. Philip took the box with him to the cabin of the wreck to protect himself from the wind. He opened it and saw something strange. There should have been tapes in the box that recorded the flight parameters, but the place after them was empty. Did someone take them out? Or maybe they weren't there at all. Philip remembered the anonymous letters he had received earlier. What if their author was in possession of the black box tapes? The next day, they began to hack into the plane's interior. It wasn't the easiest task, but it worked out in the end. Although the opening in the cabin was small, they managed to squeeze in. The hole in the wreck's hull was large enough for Philip to scramble inside. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. There were stacks of boxes in front of him. Something gleamed brightly in the dark end of the plane. Philip walked over to the shiny object and picked it up. It looked like a pistol bullet, though slightly flattened. Philip's friends finally went inside. They stood in one place with their eyes wide open. What they saw exceeded their expectations. Philip showed them his find and then pointed to the nose of the plane. Together, they opened the cockpit door and were ready to see the worst. The cockpit, however, was empty. There were no bodies or other signs that anyone had been inside. Philip was still looking around the cockpit while Greg ran to Theo's cabin to get the crowbar. It was the only way to open the chests, and when they did, they couldn't believe their eyes. Why hadn't he called earlier and said he was a scientist who wanted to investigate the mystery of the crashed plane? Philip confessed that the chests are filled with gold bars and the black box is empty. He gave the police all the information he had, so his friends were no longer needed. Philip was offered help in solving the mystery, to which he agreed. Philip, Lincoln, and Greg helped the police and received a Medal of Honor for finding the plane. But this is not the end of the story. One more person had to be found. Anonymous, who wrote letters to Philip. The police promised to find the person, but it turned out to be more difficult than they thought. Philip and his friends returned home. They wrote a book based on their adventure. It became a bestseller, and to this day, its readers wonder who the anonymous informant might have been. Who is he, and why did he do all this?